what you're actually doing as a writer is carrying a torch through that mansion, which illumines that bit, that bit, that bit, and that bit. And the whole of the rest of the hinterland is in the shadows behind. And you don't have to know everything. Luckily, you don't have to know everything to write. You just have to sort of give the impression, the sensations of the presence of a whole world around.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund, or RLF for short. I'm Caroline Sanderson and I'm a writer and books journalist. On this podcast, we bring hand-picked author guests into conversation with the extensive bank of recorded archive material which the RLF has built up over the past decade or so. This archive features a wide range of writers discussing different aspects of their experience and process. And consequently, the recordings present a rather more rounded picture of the writing life than you might find elsewhere. Today, we welcome Tessa Hadley to the Collected podcast. Tessa is the author of 8 highly praised novels, including Everything Will Be All Right, The London Train, and Free Love, and 4 collections of stories, including Sunstroke, Married Love, and After the Funeral. Her most recent book, The Party, is a novella, which I much enjoyed, so I'm keen to ask about that. Tessa has won an array of awards, including a Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction in 2016, and her stories appear regularly in magazines, including The New Yorker. I myself have been among her many devoted fans since her first novel, Accidents in the Home, which came out in 2002. Tessa has a marvellous eye for telling detail and for the small but somehow significant moments in the intimate, everyday lives of her characters. Tessa, welcome. That novella I mentioned, The Party, I think for me, part of the satisfaction from reading it came from the wonderfully concentrated experience of being able to read it in one sitting, which I did, a sort of intense burst of pleasure and immersion. Is that one of the attractions of shorter fiction for you, that concentrated experience you can give to the reader?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's true of short stories, isn't it? And then the novella is a kind of really interesting development on that basis. I love that. I think writers feel it too. The concentrated immersion is so different to the long marriage one has to a novel when one's writing it, which, has its slack periods, hopefully never on the page, but in your emotions, your doubt and your sort of worrying that where's it going to go. It's not like that with either a short story or a novella. It's kind of all in one, and you see the ending close ahead of you. You can almost put your hand on it while you're writing, and I think that's true for readers. You hold judgment, I think, in suspension with shorter form until you get to that end, and then you think, that, of course, I was waiting for that. Now I know what this is about. You couldn't do that with a novel.
I love that idea that you can sort of see the ending in the distance already, but you're not quite sure how you're going to get there. So I think I'm right in saying that you spent a long time writing and striving to be a writer before really finding your voice and beginning to write like yourself, as I think you yourself have put it. So just to get us thinking about this theme, let's listen to our first clip. Here's children's writer Jasbinder Bilan talking about her journey into writing and the discovery she quickly made.
As a young girl, although I loved reading books and writing stories and wanted more than anything to become a writer one day, I was never sure how people became proper authors. Nobody ever took the time to tell me the truth of the matter, that all the books stacked like sweets on library bookshelves didn't appear there by magic. Someone had to sit down and write each one. That was a big surprise. The first of many about the writing world. I come from a long line of homegrown storytellers. At extended family gatherings, my mother would cook big pots of fragrant Indian food, and suddenly stories about our beloved farm close to the Himalaya would spring into the conversation. My imagination was bursting with images of vast green fields of wheat, a cheeky wild monkey called Omar, who adopted our family and got up to all sorts, mixed in with the stories my dear grandmother told. Since I couldn't find any stories like this in the library, I decided I was going to write one myself. My children's book was going to be a story inspired by my roots in India and my grandmother's belief in reincarnation. I was going to surprise everyone and put a book on the shelf that would be like a mirror for many children and a window into a new world for many more. The story, Song of the Mountain, was an adventure about a girl called Asha who, guided by the spirit of her grandmother in the form of a lammergeier bird, goes on a dangerous journey through the Himalaya in search of her missing father. My writing journey, just like Asha's, was long, with many setbacks. But just like Asha, I felt the presence of my own grandmother throughout the ups and downs. She wouldn't let me give up when the rejections came. When I entered my manuscript for the Times Chicken House Prize in 2016, I never imagined my story had much of a chance. One dark winter night, while waiting for my boys in the school car park, I had a call that would change everything. It was Barry Cunningham, the magician of children's stories and director of Chicken House Books, and his news that Song of the Mountain had been shortlisted for the prize absolutely blew me away. In June 2017, on a baking hot day at the incredible Savile Club, I had the biggest surprise of my writing life when the judges announced my story as the overall winner of the iconic Times Chicken House Prize. Song of the Mountain changed its name to Asha and the Spirit Bird, and my little story became an actual book that children could borrow or buy. More importantly, my childhood dreams of becoming an author had finally come true. And no, it didn't happen by magic. I had to sit down day after day and write one word after the other until it was finished.
I love Jasbinder's honesty there and also that she took that chance. I don't particularly get the impression that you have ever thought that writing happens by magic, Tessa. But I think there were 4 sort of, in inverted commas, starter novels before you found that truth as a writer. How did you find it and how did you know when you had?
I think as a child, most children think books get there by magic. I was just writing the other day about when I first read Jane Austen as a child. And I can remember it had awful illustrations, but it didn't occur to me those had been added later. I just thought they were part of the package of the book. I think I started out without her clarity about turning to your own material for your subject matter. So I, for a long time, tried to write other people's books. And in a way, I was connecting with the top of my head as a reader to the books I most admired. And I wasn't looking in the right place because what I eventually connected with was that child in me, not the one writing rather awkward childlike stories, but the one playing fantasy games with her friends. It's the games, I think, that were the great source of dreaming, imagining, acting out, seeing the scenes in front of our eyes. I had sort of 2 or 3 little friends and also sometimes my cousins. We played these games which were stories. And I don't mean I've ever used any of those stories exactly in adult fiction, because writing for adults is quite different. But it feels as if it's the same source that suddenly you think, this is not only what I know, but it's what's suggestive to me. I'm hungry for it. It's rich material. I can take a little piece, pull a thread, and there's more and more of it, and it gets thicker and richer the further on I go. So that's the feeling that I eventually got after struggling with, if you like, the clever part of my brain to be a good girl and write the kind of good books that I admired.
That's so interesting. Thinking back to childhood when we try on other identities, don't we, and other lives. It's just part of what we do as children.
And when we try and write that down, we are so dissatisfied with what comes out on the page compared to the books we love, for instance. But playing, we're good at playing. We're really good at it. And that's what you kind of connect to, I think, when you become a writer.
Yes, and I've read a short story of yours where I think you've imported a couple of things from your own childhood, so can see that kind of continuum in your work. And there's a great quote from you where you say that when we read something really good, we feel that it's like a great mansion that we've been allowed to enter, which in itself, it sounds like a kind of children's game. But as an apprentice writer, we have doubt about this. You know, we don't feel that sense of the spaciousness of the imagination and that, as you put it, this mansion inside ourselves.
Yeah. And also, I think when you read something you love, you sort of think, how do they know all that? How can they get all that right? This is a complicated idea, not quite the same thing we've been talking about. What you're actually doing as a writer is carrying a torch through that mansion, which illumines that bit, that bit, that bit, and that bit. And the whole of the rest of the hinterland is in the shadows behind. And you don't have to know everything. Luckily, you don't have to know everything to write. You just have to sort of give the impression, the sensations of the presence of a whole world around.
Yes, because you can build up actually a picture from glimpses, can't you? And I feel that in the way that you write about character, and that you don't get a very long description of what someone's like, but you've just picked the bits that give you that. Yes. Well, we mentioned your novella, The Party, and not being a fiction writer myself, I'm always so interested in how fiction writers like you decide what form a developing idea will take. I mean, how do you know whether it's a story, a novel in embryo, or indeed a novella? And I wonder if you know immediately, or whether that can change, and how different they feel in the writing.
I think I do know immediately, usually. In fact, maybe always. And there's a certain amount of deliberateness in finding stories. Sometimes something just pops into your imagination in the middle of the night, in those wonderful semi-dreaming, semi-awake times, which are so fertile for inventing. But often you're thinking, what can I write? What could the next novel be about? What could the one after next? I need to have something sort of ready. What could it be? What could it be? And you're sort of searching with a deliberateness. But at the same time, you know when you find the thing that's right, that it has this heat of its own. It's not just your muscle work that's making it exciting. Yes, that's what it has to be. Of course it is. Oh, yes, that's giving off all sorts of sensations already. I'm pulling on that thread. Lots of, it's a house, it's a mansion I can go into. And I think I know right away if it's a short story, because that feels like one piece, I can hold it. Whereas a novel is just a door opening, and really it is a mansion. I'm not sure a short story is a mansion. I don't know what it is. I can't think of a good architectural metaphor, but a novel is definitely a mansion, and there's lots more rooms that will emerge over the weeks and months of, even in preparation, even before you start. The novella, I mean, it was terribly deliberate in that my publisher suggested, have you ever thought of writing a novella? And I thought, no, of course not. I never would. Went home. And strangely, I thought, what would a novella feel like to write? It would be like a story, but quite a bit longer. Maybe it would be like 3 chapters, and it would have the tightness of a story, but just have that little bit more room to breathe. And then I got it, and it couldn't have been a novel, and it was too much for a short story. So it had its form encoded in the material.
It was what it was.
It was what it was.
Yes. And I've been rereading your first novel, Accidents in a Home, and finding that sense of stories within the novel as well, which is fascinating. Okay, so given that your work takes those different forms, let's listen to novelist, screenwriter and playwright Portia Newland talking about being genre fluid.
From the beginning, before I even began my first novel, I've always known what type of writer I wanted to be. I imagined writing in much the same vein as I read, or watched film, or theatre, as widely as possible, with no discrimination between different writing forms. I remain highly sceptical of the rigid boundaries that separate writing formulated to achieve different aims, and it saddens me to see or hear the fixed views people attribute to what's basically a choice or preference in style. So I suppose there was no other means for me to write. I was destined to be genre fluid from the start. My first novel was centred on a working-class social realism that has become known as urban fiction or street fiction. I'm not keen on those labels. I find them restrictive, but I'm very interested in locating these novels that are attributed to them or kept out. The literary antecedents for my novel include Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk, Anne Petry's The Street, and Rosa Guy's A Measure of Time, alongside Sam Selvon's Lonely Londoners, Joan Riley's Unbelonging, and even A Clockwork Orange. I've never heard any of these works described as street fiction, even though they contain many elements of the genre. The restrictive nature of how critics define what makes work fit certain genres has made me wary enough to feel that they don't define what I do adequately enough for me to stick to one. So 2 books in, I decided to do something else and turn to crime fiction, although even my second book was structured completely differently to the first and comprised of interlinked short stories despite being set in the same world. Fluidity is freedom, and for a writer, freedom is key. While crime was fun, I found industry and academic ideals around what a crime novel is and is not limited in their own way, and so I moved on for the next work again, turning to surreal short stories. This was immensely liberating. Since then, I've never entirely shifted from that style, and still write stories like that to this day. In future, I envisage myself writing sci-fi, historical, experimental, satirical, and a host of other novel forms. I don't want to be a writer who's known for just doing one thing or a master of none. Just a writer who has found a myriad of styles for the themes I wish to tackle, and someone who maintained my own interest by constantly playing with genre. What's most satisfying is the ability to blend genres in a mix of styles which, with luck, complement each other and the many facets of my character. This is where contemporary fiction seems to be heading more, and also where a lot of fresh discoveries lie. If we can blur boundaries and redefine what genre actually means, we have a chance of creating fiction that evolves and builds on what went before.
Now, Korsha doesn't want to be typecast, clearly, and why should he be? I'm thinking about your work, which has its heartland in the sort of everyday vicissitudes of lives and relationships. And I wondered, although I'm not trying to typecast you either, whether you like having that sort of hallmark heartland to anchor you as a writer.
Yes, I think I do. That's so interesting to listen to somebody who feels the opposite, who feels it's constraining. It was sort of what I needed before I could write well. I needed to know what my writing sounded like and where it was at home. So yes, it is very different. In a way, I would love to write a huge, socially inclusive, highly political state-of-the-nation novel, but I can't. So I think you don't get to choose what you can write. I think the early years and the struggle, if there is one, is to find the thing that's waiting. And that's how it felt for me. And I don't get a choice. That's the thing I know about and I have authority about, and I can pull the thread and the stuff comes up. It wouldn't happen if I was doing something else.
Well, you mentioned Jane Austen earlier, and I mean, there couldn't be bigger themes than there are in her work, for example. Yeah. So it feels like it's a mistake to sort of think that you can't have political big themes in what's a smaller, much smaller canvas.
Absolutely, but I mean, she is still blamed for that, or perhaps nobody blames Jane Austen for anything anymore. But I'm sure there are readers who find, well, why isn't she writing about the Napoleonic Wars, or for that matter, slavery, which has a very interesting sort of a slightly offstage role in Mansfield Park. I was just reading Persuasion on the train coming up today. I was actually thinking how much there is about the Navy and the wars. It's all there, but it's in the way she knew it, which was as stuff happening behind the scenes and stuff percolating through to those women's spaces inside the house. You can only write with authority about the things you feel you confidently know. But at the same time, I think, while I think Jane Austen's worlds are huge in their small spaces, they're huge, I don't think a writer should go around comforting herself too complacently and thinking, oh, it's fine, I'm really encompassing the whole of humanity when I write this little domestic scene between a husband and wife. You should actually feel guilty and the pressure of the world all the time. You should think, how can this matter in the face of stuff, politics, everything, injustice? That argument should sort of be there, making your work nervous, if that makes sense. Otherwise, you really are just going to write sort of, novels about cake and tea and problems with kids at school.
Yes, it's why does it matter, doesn't it? And I really feel that in your work. You feel the social context, you feel the sort of climate in which your characters are living in, and that feels very, very strong and present to me, and the pressures that exerts on them in one way and another.
Yeah, I thought it was a good. I mean, that's my subject in a way, is almost the comedy of our conscientious, rather left-leaning bourgeoisie today, because Reams has been written about the English bourgeoisie, but, it used to be a really stuffy old, rather right-wing establishment thing, and brilliant writers wrote about that and got it, Elizabeth Bowen and Virginia Woolf and so on. And I think in our age, it's slightly changed its character, being anthropological about it, and we need some recorders of that. But again, that's, one should never feel too comfortable that you're succeeding in doing that. But it's lovely to hear you say so. That's good to hear.
Well, our next clip features novelist Jonathan Buckley talking to James McConaughey about why he never returns to a novel once he's finished writing it.
When you're at work on a novel, you become certain areas of certain modes of thought, certain modes of expression, certain parts of your vocabulary are put aside. You become the writer that book requires, or that book makes you be. I would say that sounds terribly high. I mean, I don't mean this in the sort of shamanic sense that the novel manifests itself through I'm just a conduit for it. I don't quite mean that, but each book has a certain register. Once that register has been determined at the start of writing, you have to stay in that register. And once the book is done, I always found that register is no longer available to you. You cannot again be the person who wrote that book. And it's not just, again, back to this idea of the self as being a sort of a relay race of an infinite number of subsections, that you can no longer recover the person you were a week ago, but you are the person who writes the book isn't even the person who is living his day-to-day life while the book is being written. So when the book is finally finished, when it's gone off the printer, you can do nothing more about it. That episode is over. And if I go back and look at the books, I want to rewrite them. I no longer see things in that way. I'm thinking in a different register. There's nothing to be. I find it unbearable to look at the books.
The question of writing each one in a different register, again, this is the opposite of what most novelists do. Most novelists find their voice, and they stay in that voice, and every book is an emanation of that voice.
Do you think so? I mean, you can identify that voice. There are things that enable you to identify each book as being by that particular writer. But I mean, I'm sure there are some writers you could take a book they wrote in their 20s and not be able to distinguish it from one they wrote in their 40s. But I would have thought in...
A case study, maybe, not an example, springs to mind, which is William Golding, whose novels are dramatically different in register, treatment, one from another.
Yeah.
And yet, there is, I think you said to me yourself once, the one thing you like about William Golding is that there is no doubt that sentence could only have been written by William Golding.
Absolutely. Not necessarily to commend William, but nonetheless, there is a distinctive imprint there.
Is there a distinctive imprint of Jonathan Buckley?
I couldn't possibly tell you. I really couldn't. I couldn't. I think there are certain preoccupations in the books that connect them. And there are certain, I suppose some people might say there's a certain coolness of style, or sort of detachment, or sort of carefulness, I don't know.
Well, we talked a bit about writing like yourself and no one else. What resonates with you from that really fascinating discussion?
Yes, it is fascinating. And I know just what he means. And I think you can't recognise your own temperamental imprint on your work in the way that other people can. Just like you don't know what you're like. You don't know what you're like in a room, or you don't know what you look like. So all of that's what your style feels like to you. You just live in it. I feel my novels do exist in a continuum. But when I look back, which I almost never do, I have a kind of post-birth affection for the books, and I look at them a bit and I read them a bit, more the short stories than the novels, funnily. And then I get a kind of horror of them and I don't really want to look at them. And there's certain ones I haven't looked at for 10 years, haven't opened for 10 years. They're as alien to me as if I read letters from another era. I mean, you really do change. That's another thing. If you write across enough time, you change. Your insights change, your personality changes. I can feel that from one book to another. And sometimes if I have opened a book for some reason, I think, oh my goodness, did I know that? Did I write that? And it can feel quite other.
It says a lot about the space you are in when you're actually writing, doesn't it? Compared with where you are when you're.
But he's saying
not.
Something more. I'm simplifying what he's saying, in fact, because he's saying something really complex about the book sort of taking you itself into its own space in which you become a certain vocabulary in a certain world, which is very fascinating. I'd have to think long about that.
Lots to reflect on there. So I know that you work and rework very intensely when you are writing, which is quite a slow and dense process for you. And it reminded me of reading about Flaubert when I was studying French literature and his lifelong compulsion to find le mot juste, just the right word, and no other one would do. And it could take weeks to get a single page right. Jonathan was talking there about finding the register of a particular book, and we've just said that you're a sort of different person when you're immersed in it. And then that sense of not really wanting to return and not liking it when you do. So how do you then know, or what's the point of satisfaction? How do you know when you've got there, when it's finished, essentially, I suppose?
I mean, that's a much more sort of urgent and difficult problem, page by page in a way, than it is finishing the book itself or the short story itself. Because normally when I get to the end of a book, definitely I will then put it aside a little bit, maybe just for a few days or a couple of weeks, read through. Definitely there'll be some cuts. There might be absences, things I suddenly think, oh, that needs to be there, or something I haven't said, something I've missed out. But essentially, when I get to the end, I tend to feel, unless something's gone wrong, it's done. It's done now. It just needs adjusting and pulling in a bit, like a dressmaker fitting clothes to the person in a final sort of fitting to make sure it looks all right. So it's in the sentence and on the page that the real labour of getting it right. Because if you haven't got that paragraph right, you can't write the next paragraph because you don't know what the brick underneath is like. Or I don't want a brick-built novel. That's what the stone underneath is like. So your whole thing would be built on shaky foundations. That's why although I know my favourite writers, like Alice Munro, did really rough drafts and rewrote and moved everything. But I can't imagine working like that. I have to do it this rather slightly sort of tedious and obsessive way of one stone at a time. Yeah, and how do you know? It is, I always think it's in the eye, not in the ear.
I was reading something you said about that, which I found because, if I'm sort of teaching writing skills, I must try read it aloud or hear it in your head, but it has to look right for you.
And primarily, that is what the modern novel or short story are written for. Perhaps a little bit less so than 30 years ago because of audiobooks and things. But we write for the eye. And when you're reading, you're doing such a complex thing and you are doing all kinds of funny things like reading. This is not your own work, but somebody else's, skimming a sentence, jumping a sentence, thinking, oh, I didn't read that very carefully. Go back. Oh, I didn't even notice that was in there. And at the same time, then dwelling on that bit because those words sort of zing out to you. Reading with the eye is so complex. I think there's far more adjustment between reading for the eye and listening to an audiobook than anybody's maybe they have, but I haven't heard anybody really reckoning. I find audiobooks so thrusting. There's no room for that sort of, playing around with what's on the page and looking at it twice. And anyway, so when I'm writing, what I'm doing when it feels wrong is fiddling. What's wrong? There's something missing from the middle. It's missing a beat there. That sentence is full of redundant dead words. It looks grey. take them out, and then something seems to happen when I think I've got the paragraph right, which is that it sort of shrinks into place and suddenly it's seamless and I can't even find a way in because it's done. That's what it feels like. Very nice.
You've mentioned quite a few writers that in some way have inspired you. And you've mentioned Elizabeth Bowen and Alice Munro, who I know has been a favourite writer for you. I know there are lots of them. You've mentioned different ones almost in different interviews, I think. But obviously we all draw quite eclectically as writers. So I thought we'd just bring in our next clip now. And this is poet Jonathan Edwards speaking about 3 writers who perennially inspire him.
All of my favourite writers are Dylan Thomas. I say this because his writing is so varied. There are so many of him. I love his comic prose. The moment in A Child's Christmas in Wales when Mrs. Prothero asks the firemen putting out the blazing Christmas tree if they would like something to read. Or the moment of perfect bathos in The Peaches when the preaching Gwilym pronounces, "Oh God, man, you're like a bloody cat." Another part of Thomas is the incredible sonic and formal ambition and achievement of his poems. There's no other voice which is like his. And if poetry in part is about celebrating the absolute individuality of the person who wrote it, it's difficult to see how any poetry could be better. I see his development as a poet running from early work like Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines, which is linguistically fascinating and full of beans but communicates little, to late masterpieces like Fernhill and Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, where he has, for me, found the perfect balance of linguistic energy and communicational coherence. He'd learned by writing prose how to say something to readers, and the thing that gets me is where he'd have gone next, what he could have done with the 40 more or so years he should have had. I feel very nervous any time I'm in a room which doesn't have a copy of Deaths and Entrances in it, and he is constant inspiration and challenge to get better. Another book I don't want to be without is Here Comes the Night by Alan Gillis. I actually carry this around with me in a knapsack to every poetry event and professional engagement. And if I get nervous at all, I just think Gillis is with me. It's a book of the most extraordinary vivacity. These tumbling, long poems which are so in touch with the musical potential of language, but also so aware of the language of the streets. At times, I think it's a sort of magic trick of a book, because however many times I read it, every time I open it, there seems to be yet another fabulous poem I hadn't noticed. The opening poem alone, Down Through Dark and Emptying Streets, says such brilliant things about our relationship to time in a world of social media, through a poem about a simple walk through Belfast. Lastly, no discussion of influence is complete without mentioning James Tate. I discovered his masterpiece, Return to the City of White Donkeys, about 10 years ago, and have avidly devoured all his writings since. His poems are liberating in so many ways. Formally, in their use of humour, the way that they give the 2 fingers to the self-regarding pretentiousness of much poetry. More than anything, they are liberating in their conception of the self. Tate's narratives give us a world in which anything can happen, the sort of world that someone like Larkin might be terrified by the meaninglessness of. For Tate, though, that sense that anything can happen next is opportunity, liberation, joy. I was reading his last collection and gift to the world, The Government Lake, in a doctor's waiting room a few weeks ago, and it made me laugh so hard that all the other worried people in the surgery looked round at me. That test of a poem, would this make someone laugh in a doctor's waiting room, is no bad test of quality at all, and the way Tate can do this, along with the work of these other writers, is a constant inspiration.
I'm sure we could have a whole other conversation about how particular writers inspire and delight you in their different ways. I wondered if you're one of those writers who can happily read other fiction while you're in the thick of writing something, or do you need a sort of clear head for your own craft and words?
I cannot ever imagine that, partly because, well, ever since I got published, I'm always writing, so I'd never read anything. And no, it would be anguishing to be so deprived and to not read. I can't imagine not reading every day, all the time. I have a book with me right now in my handbag, just in case, in case I stop to have a coffee somewhere. So, no. And in fact, not only that, when I sit down to write, you come from breakfast and putting the washing machine on and maybe making a doctor's appointment, and you sit down. How do you get across the threshold of that sort of dailiness into the fantasy world of making up words, getting that paragraph right? How do you, it's like rising to an occasion. And one of the ways that I help myself up that staircase, more architectural metaphors, is to have some books on my desk. And so often for the whole length of me writing a novel, I'll have some beloved book beside me, maybe just the one or two all the way through. So at the moment I have Bowen's Death of the Heart and Anita Bruckner, Brief Lives. And I'm just reading a paragraph or so, and something about their sentences just lifts me up, and suddenly my mind's in a different kind of zone, and it's engaged with a new kind of intensity and specificity of language. And then I look at my screen. Sometimes it's almost weird. I just need the book open. I don't even need to look at it. It's like Jonathan Edwards was saying, there's a sort of just feeling it's there. Talismanic.
Yeah. Yes, I was just about to say that. Well, I love that, because I think a lot of writers feel, oh no, I'm going to somehow be infected by somebody else's style. But you gave this advice that in an interview that I read: don't be afraid of copying the work you most admire when you're starting out. Sometimes a bold imitation is immensely liberating, and through it you can find your way to your own words. And I love that it's a sort of like a...
and you never sound like the person you're copying. You think you will, but actually when I got students to do that, they never did. They always sounded like themselves, but they sounded like themselves on steroids, turbocharged, which is what writing has to be. It isn't your daily self who just put the stuff in the washing machine. You can't write like that. You'll be boring. So you have to give yourself that steroid shot. That's a funny thing to describe it as, but it is a bit like that. And getting someone to... I can remember doing my English GCE back in, God knows, 1972 or something. And the exercise was, as if they would dare to set this now, they gave you the opening paragraph of D.H. Lawrence's short story, Odour of Chrysanthemums, and said, carry on the story from here. Isn't that one? And I loved that. I loved it, and I could do it. So I think, like all great arts, you begin in imitation, and maybe you never stop copying. You're not alone, for goodness sake. The language is everybody's, and the tradition of literature is all of us, and it's in us. It makes us who we are, makes the words that we use, they're not ours. So I don't think that ever ends entirely.
Oh, it's so illuminating hearing you talk about your writing and the craft of it. So here's a leading question to conclude with. What does success look and feel like to you? And to give you time to ponder that question, let's listen to novelist Claire Chambers reflecting on the peaks and troughs of her writing life.
The writer's life is a series of peaks and troughs, but no peak is perhaps higher or harder to climb than the first one, getting published. That first moment of affirmation, when after many rejections or silences, a publisher finally says yes, must be celebrated to the full, for it is unlikely ever to be equalled. Even if you know quite well that most books sink without trace, and most writers do not make enough to live on, you will not yet have internalised this truth. In your heart, you know that you are different and special. Optimism that due reward will follow effort is as yet undimmed. No one tells you that having once been published is no guarantee that you will be again. Indeed, if your first book is commercially unsuccessful, it may even be harder to sell your second than it was to find a publisher in the first place. Debuts tend to have a publicity momentum of their own. You may, after all, be the next big thing. But this is a card you can only play once. No one tells you that the commissioning editor who fell in love with your book and offered you a 2-book deal, and who was such a champion of your writing, will be headhunted or fired before your second is even delivered. It will be inherited by one of their junior colleagues, who is more interested in curating their own list than in picking up someone else's leftovers. Halfway through the editing process, they will leave too. No one tells you that having pored over every page of your proofs with fanatical attentiveness, the first thing you will see on opening a finished copy of your book, at random, is a particularly hideous typo. No one tells you that you will never again be able to enter a bookshop purely for the innocent pleasure of browsing. Your eye will always be drawn to the space where your book ought to be, if only they stocked it. And if by chance you do spot a substantial pile of your books, you will not rejoice, but assume that they are still there because no one is buying them. Nothing will please you. No one tells you that the shelf life of a hardback is barely longer than that of a yoghurt. Space on those coveted tables at the front of bookshops is limited, and boxes of new arrivals will turn up every week to claim them. Within a couple of months, one copy of your book will be banished to the alphabetical section in the remotest reaches of the shop, and the rest returned to the warehouse unsold. No one tells you that the generous and complimentary reviews in the literary pages will pass unnoticed by your friends and relatives. But the one snarky, condescending remark will somehow be seen by everyone you know, and their commiserations will haunt you for decades. No one tells you that the reason remainder copies are so cheap is because they are immemorially unsaleable, no matter how many events you plan to do and how cheaply you plan to sell them. They will take up valuable space in your loft and move with you from house to house, and when you die, your children will have to pay for a skip to dispose of them. And if, having been told all these things, you still feel that the greatest moment in the life of a book, finishing it, is reward enough, then you are a writer, my friend, and there is no helping you.
Gosh, who'd be a writer, eh? I'm just sitting here thinking that we're all mad, really. We've talked earlier about you were writing for a long time before you found critical and commercial success, which came to you, as most interviews point out, sort of later in life than for other writers. But I love this thing you say about I wouldn't change those strange, anonymous, quiet, private years of feeling quite low sometimes because I so longed to write and I couldn't do it. Feeling like a real person with friends and family, I wouldn't lose that. That seems part of everything to me.
Yes, I do think that, although my younger self might say, yeah, it's all very well for you, but this is no fun. But in some puritanical Protestant way, I think it was good for me. And I still do think that. And I think Claire's she's so funny. That's so brilliant. And so much of it is true. I was thinking about that just this morning. As I came up to London on the train, I was thinking about when I heard my first book, Accidents in the Home, was going to be published. And I remember saying to myself, this will be the best. This will be the best you'll ever get. Just enjoy it. And then I was thinking that hadn't been true. I suppose I've been lucky, not bestseller or anything like that until, if anything, just by my fingernails very recently. A quiet career, like they say, can't happen anymore, with quite modest sales but nice reviews. I've just been so lucky that was what suited me and what I needed, and I didn't fall into that trap of, debut novel sells a lot and then no follow through. It suited my temperament, what happened to me. I've been so lucky. But just the blessing of being a writer, which is what she finishes with, I wasn't right till I had that. And so I actually feel lucky every day about that. I don't know why. I don't know why one's brain would be wired that way. I mean, some very early childhood reading would be part of it. But that was it. That was what I needed to make me at home in the world, the feeling that my little piece of it, I could make this effort. And who knows, absolutely all in the skip. Second-hand shops flooded for a while with remainder copies of your books, and then they're gone. But it's all right. It's what I do, and I love it.
It's been such a pleasure, Tessa. Thanks so much for joining us on the Collected podcast.
Pleasure for me too.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin, and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.